So now that we have a basic idea of why we might want to use Vue, let's indeed jump into Vue and its basics and its core syntax. And for that, I got a very simple starting project, if you want to call it like this. A simple web page, which you of course find attached to this lecture, so that you can start with the same project. Now, I opened it here in a browser simply by double-clicking that HTML file side by side with my editor, just so that it's a bit easier to see what changes on the page once we start writing some code. Now, speaking of code, this is a very simple starting project. If I briefly hide this sidebar here, also with the shortcut, you see the HTML skeleton is very simple. I just got a header, got a section, an h2 tag, and an empty paragraph tag. And I got an import where I import Vue, so the Vue framework, and I got an import to my own app.js file, and also import to some Google Fonts and my own CSS file. Now, the CSS file is not too important. It has some basic styles, but this is not a CSS course, so I won't bore you with those. I do have a separate CSS course if you want to learn more about that. Instead, let's focus on JavaScript and Vue. And here the JavaScript file is totally empty. Now here's one thing I'll do, and I'll not do this throughout the entire course, but I'll do it here at the beginning. I'll change the editor layout here in Visual Studio Code to use 2 rows, and I'll open the index.html file in the top row and the app.js file in the bottom row and close the sidebar. I'm doing this because this will allow me to show you how our JavaScript code and the HTML code interacts. Later, once we write more complex JavaScript code, I'll move away from this setup so that we can see the JavaScript code on the entire page. But to get started, this will be just fine. So with that, we got the HTML code, we got the JavaScript code. Now, the first thing we want to do when we want to use some Vue features is we want to connect Vue to our HTML code. We want to let Vue know which part of this HTML code should be controlled by Vue, because we'll only be able to utilize Vue in parts that are controlled by Vue. Now, here my first goal is very simple. I got this dummy web page where I want to output my course goal, or your course goal. Something like finish the course, master Vue, anything like that. Now, of course, we can just write that in here and we're done. But this course is about Vue, and whilst controlling this with Vue and outputting this text with Vue will be a bit overkill for now, it is good to get started with a basic example like that so that we can later also explore more advanced examples. Therefore, let's not output this text like this, but let's instead use Vue to output some text here, some text which we potentially could change dynamically. And for that, the first thing we need to do is we need to create a Vue app. This is always the first step. You want to control a part of your HTML code with a Vue app. And you do this by using Vue, which is a globally available object, thanks to this Vue import. And then on this Vue object, we can call create app. And this will do what the name implies. It creates a Vue app. Now we can store this app in a variable or constant. So here I'll store it in a constant. And this is a default JavaScript feature, has nothing to do with Vue. And now we want to let Vue know which part of this HTML code should be controlled by that Vue app. Now, I want to control this section because it's this section which contains this paragraph which I want to manipulate through Vue. We could also just control this paragraph, but we will later add more features inside of this section, hence I'll take the entire section. Now, we do that by calling mount, the mount method on this app object which we created with create app. Mount now wants a string. And that string should hold a CSS selector which uniquely identifies the element in our DOM, in our HTML code, which we want to control. Now here, this section has an ID of user goal. So we can use this ID. And typically you will use IDs because you want a unique selector. And IDs are great unique selectors because IDs should be unique on your page. Now, how does such an ID selector look like? Well, it's simply a hash symbol and then your ID, in this case, user goal. And this will tell Vue that we want to connect our created Vue app to this section in the HTML code. Now, if we save the app.js file, this connection is established. But the connection alone doesn't do much. Instead, we can now use Vue features to interact with this control section. And we do use such features by passing an object to create app. This is an object which we can use to configure this app. We configure the various options of this app, you could say. Now, one key option which we can set is the data option, the data configuration. And this name is not up to you. It has to be data. You can use some clearly defined specific keys, so property names, in this object which you pass to create app. You cannot just use any arbitrary names because Vue will look for these specific property names like data and like a couple of other names you'll see throughout this course. So here we get the data key. Data wants a function as a value. So we could provide one like this, and that would be totally valid. Or we use the method shorthand, which we can use in modern JavaScript, which is supported here. And that looks like that. It's the same. It basically means the value stored in the data property is a function. Now, what should this function do? It should do one very simple yet important thing. It returns an object, and always an object. Not an array, not a number, not a string, always an object. And in this returned object, you can now set up any key value pairs with any key, so with any property names of your choice. Something like message or course goal, totally up to you. And the values for those properties are also totally up to you. Here I'm going to store a string, but you could store anything that makes sense for your use case, for your application. You could store a boolean, you could store a number, you could store an array, or yet another object. But here I want a simple string. My course goal could be finish the course and learn Vue. Now, what's the idea behind this? What's the idea behind this data property, which we now configured in this Vue app? Well, anything that's part of the object you return in data can now be used in your Vue-controlled HTML part. And whilst this is not too exciting for static content which never changes, like our string here, this will be super awesome as soon as we add some reactivity. And we, for example, react to the user clicking a button to then change data. You got a first glimpse at that in the first course module, and you'll see way more of that throughout the course. But to start simple, we can output what's stored in course goal in this Vue-controlled HTML part by using a special syntax here. A special syntax which will only work because this is controlled by Vue.